So it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Keith Fox, who's the Associate Director of the Faraday Institute and also Professor of Biochemistry at Southampton University. His third hat is as Chair of the as a Trustee of Christians in Science, and also he's a Senior Executive Editor of Nucleic Acids Research, so someone who is highly involved in both science and faith activities, as well as being a reader in his local Church of England. Keith started his career here in Cambridge, studying natural sciences, doing a PhD in pharmacology and a research fellowship after that before he moved to Southampton. And now he's going to speak on genes, God and genetics.
It's a privilege to be here this morning amongst friends to talk about two things that have been a passion in my life. As a Christian, God is obviously a passion, and as a scientist and a biochemist, DNA has been one of my passions and fascinations for years. And if I was to try and teach you a little bit of biochemistry, there are plenty of structures I could put on the screen that your minds would go blank and you would quickly switch off and not listen to me for much longer. But if I put this one on the screen and I say to you, there is a molecular structure, what is it? And it's almost too embarrassing to say, isn't it? It's DNA. It's become something that, even if you don't know what it does, it's familiar to the non-scientist, the children as much as older people. And in fact, it's become a bit of an icon of our age. It's so familiar. I wish that other biochemical structures were just as fascinating to the general public, but I've given up on that. But if you look at the sort of things it's used for, here are the ways in which it's infiltrated our society. You can find it on postage stamps as celebrating, obviously something to do with medicine as well. It's used as a marketing tool. I don't know how they managed to do that. And across here you can buy DNA perfume. It has nothing to do with DNA at all. It's just the name that's given to it. You can buy it for him or for her. It comes in bottles that are helical in structure. If you look at very carefully, that bottle is a 3-stranded helix, not a 2-stranded helix. So it's become a little bit of an icon. It's a phrase that we can use. How many times have you heard or even dared use yourself that phrase, it's in their DNA? As though it's something that's inescapable. It's part of our makeup, that do what we like, we cannot escape from it. And I'm grateful to Dennis Alexander for noting a few of these over the years, where the media portray a little bit of science in a very popular way to make it sound all very simple, as though we have no choices. So we talk about the love cheat gene, the gangster gene, the mean gene, genes to hormones. Genes help shape our political beliefs. Cigarettes, blame it on your genes. Gluttony gene, liberal gene, happiness gene. All those as though we have no choice in life. It's written into our very makeup. In fact, some wag wrote to The Guardian and suggested there is such a thing as the geneticism gene, a gene that predisposes some people to think that behavior is determined by your genes. And which used in all sorts of ways. Here is Boston University advertising to their alumni, of course trying to get money out of them, as all universities try to do out of their alumni, and trying to tell them that it's in their genes to be generous. They build great relationship. It's in their DNA. Giving back, it's in their DNA, as though it's something you can't escape from. It's generally a part of you. If you go away with no other message from today and the talk that I give you, please do not use that phrase. Because it rather suggests that we're predetermined. We have no choice in life. We're rather automatons dictated by our DNA sequences. I know it's well-meaning and it's a good catchphrase, but for the sakes of those who are sort of professional biochemists, please don't use that, and you'll see why as we go along as well. How many of you, I wonder, have at various stages researched your family tree or know people who have done? And the question comes as to how much of your makeup is determined by the place that you're brought up, the people you mixed with, or your inheritance of your genes from your ancestors. There are 6 generations of males in my family. from my son at the top there down to my great-great-grandfather in the bottom right-hand corner. How much of my character is determined by them? How much of my bad things can I blame on them? And how many of my good things are purely me, that they're irrelevant? Some things are clearly not genetic. If you look at these, we have bow ties, neckties, and no ties. That's clearly cultural and not. But some things might be. 5 of those wear glasses. My son does not. He has 20/20 vision. Other characteristics as well. I went white, I think we would say, at a fairly young age. That's clearly genetics. I have blue eyes. That's genetics. But what about other things as well? All of those are engineers, builders, scientists. There's not a streak of humanities in us. All of those, with the exception of my son in the top left, were born in Bristol. We're West Country lads. That explains some of the things about the way that we speak. If you listen very carefully, there's that Bristolian burr to my voice as we speak. We roll our words and we put R's and L's on the end of words. And that's nothing to do with genes, that's to do with where we're brought up. So can I blame my genes? What responsibility have I got for the way that I am? Those of you who travel regularly between London and Cambridge will see adverts on the trains for this company, 23andMe. Have you seen those? I will go and do it. Is you send essentially, they send you a little kit, and you send a swab of cheek cells off to them, and they will give you a list of some of your genetic characteristics. They're scientifically very sound, actually. And they will tell you whether your likelihood of suffering from diabetes or heart disease or all sorts of other things that might be recessive characteristics that are hidden within your genes. There are other companies, advertised less widely, that I think a bit more of I'd say a joke, but I say that cautiously. One of my colleagues discovered this one, Life Profile Superhero, Genetic Assessment. You are assessed your life profile in terms of your BAM, your strength, your eureka, in other words, your intelligence, and your zoom, your speed. And I think it is intended a little bit as a joke, and I have no idea what genes they're assessing. So the superhero assessment decodes secret information in your unique DNA, giving you unprecedented insights into where your superpowers lie. If you read the small print very carefully at the bottom, it does say, this product is not a diagnostic test and cannot predict your future health. Use of this product is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical judgment. Please consult your doctor if you have a question about a medical issue. And those companies that do these genetic assessments, the more reputable of them also employ genetic counselors to tell you what you might think about doing with that particular data. James Watson, one of the co-discoverers of the structure of DNA, has said, we used to think that our fate was in the stars. Now we know in large measure our fate is in our genes. And I want to unpick that today as to how much are we determined? How much is our destiny, our fate determined by our genetic makeup? Or Richard Dawkins, maybe even more provocatively, says we are machines built by DNA whose purpose is to make more copies of the same DNA. That is exactly what we're here for. We're machines for propagating DNA, and the propagation of DNA is a self-sustaining process. It's every living object's sole reason for living. If you happen not to have children, then according to Richard Dawkins' definition there, then you have failed in your definition of living. There is no purpose to life. And we'll unpack that as we go through as well. In 1953, when the structure of DNA was discovered, and I emphasize it was the structure of DNA. DNA had been known for 70 years previous to that. It was discovered by Friedrich Miescher in Switzerland in about the 1880s. They're reputed to have said over a beer in the Eagle pub in Cambridge, we have discovered the secret of life. Now, I am passionate about DNA. I like my students to get out of bed early, to work hard in the lab, and to work late in the evening. But there is more to life than just studying DNA. It tells us some things about the secret about how life is generated, how life is how some characteristics are passed from one generation to the next. But it is not itself the secret of life, as I don't need to tell you. In 2000, the first draft of the sequence of the human genome was released. Big ceremony between the US and the UK as the major institutes dealing with that. And the God word slipped into the conversations. Bill Clinton was president of the US. Francis Collins, a committed Christian, was director of the Human Genome Project. He is now director of the NIH. And here's a couple of quotes from them. Bill Clinton saying, "Today we're learning the language in which God has created life. We're given ever more awe for the complexity, the beauty, the wonder of God's most divine and sacred gift." And Francis Collins, the Christian, saying, "It's humbling for me and awe-inspiring to realize that we've caught the first glimpse of our own instruction book, previously known only to God." And with understanding these things, with getting some insights into our genetic makeup and the sequence of the human genome, brings, as does all science, it brings responsibility with that. And the president at the time pledged that that would not be misused. So he will underscore that this genetic information must never be used to stigmatize or discriminate against any individual or group. And I'll show you some examples as we go through this morning where maybe we're in danger of missing the point in that and beginning to use it to discriminate. So God and DNA, that may be a little contrived, but there are some ways in which, in the layperson's view, there are similarities in those two. Both are fairly mysterious. It's an unusual molecule. What does it do? In the same way as God is a mystery. Both somehow seem to control our destiny, from a God who is, of course, in control of things, to DNA that seems to be in control of some of our characteristics. And a sense, too, of wonder as we look at the things that God has made, and we look at the complexity of that DNA molecule, and it's awe-inspiring. The more you know about it, the more awe-inspiring it becomes. For those of you who are practicing scientists, and especially biochemists, might stick their fingers in their ears for a moment or think about what you're going to have for dinner tonight, let me tell you a little bit about the basic science. And to fill in a few words for you. You hear the word gene. What is a gene? Well, actually, even the scientists can dispute exactly what we define as a gene. But if, broadly speaking, it's a region of DNA that codes for a protein. It can be between 1,000 and, in some cases, over 1 million of those letters, A, G, C, and T, long. And those genes are put together within chromosomes. We have 23 chromosomes. And each one of those contains several thousand genes arranged along them. Actually, that's not to scale. There are large gaps in between each of the genes, and we actually now know that only about 2% of our genome actually codes for structural things like proteins and enzymes. A lot of the rest of it is involved in packaging or control, or we don't know what it does. Some of you maybe have heard the phrase junk DNA, meaning there's all that DNA that doesn't code for proteins. It's a phrase that we should no longer use. It was a sign, I think, of scientific hubris, meaning that we don't know what it does, so we'll call it junk. Now, we don't know what it does, but we know, actually, it's quite important. So just an aside, don't use that phrase either. So our 23 different chromosomes contain our 20,000 genes, roughly. 3 billion, that's 3 with 9 noughts after it, base pairs of that DNA, now sequenced for humans and sequenced for many other organisms as well, some of which have larger genomes than humans, many of which, of course, are a lot smaller. And every cell in your body contains exactly the same DNA sequence. The DNA in your brain, the cells in your brain, is exactly the same as the DNA in your big toe. They are expressing different proteins, at least I hope they are, that the structural constituents in your brain are very different, but they're coded by the same DNA molecule. Different genes are switched on and off in different tissues, and in cancer, they're switched on inappropriately that cause cells to grow when they shouldn't do. In chemically, it's actually quite a boring molecule. It is a polymer in the same way as nylon's a polymer. DNA is a polymer of those 4 repeating units with a highly reproducible and rather elegant structure. Packaged together in that small area of the nucleus at the center of the cell that may be only 10 microns, that's 10 millionths of a meter across. Very thin molecule, very long molecule packaged into that tiny space in ways that we don't properly understand, so that the right things are switched on in each cell. In each cell of your body is about 2 meters of this DNA. Every cell in your body has that. And there's about something between 10 to the 13, 10 to the 14 cells in your body. So if you multiply it all up, that says there are about 200 billion kilometers of DNA in every one of your bodies. That's enough to go to the sun and back about 500 times. It works out that it's, depending on how much adipose tissue you carry around, it's about 1% of your total body mass is your DNA. So it's not an insignificant amount of who you are anyway. And in knowing a lot about the DNA sequence, we can ask what happens when it goes wrong. Can you blame your genes? And in some instances, clearly you can. And here's a list of a few genetic disorders. There are thousands of these. Some are relatively common. Some are very rare mutations that maybe only 5 or 6 people across the world possess that give some form of a genetic disorder, disease, condition, however you want to call that. And some of them happen by, amazingly, just one change in that 3 billion. A very tiny change of one letter in the whole thing. And the best known example, well, some examples of cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia, thalassemia, are all conditions that arise from a single or just a few base changes. So here's the part of the sequence that codes for hemoglobin, that's that carries your oxygen around in your red blood cells. Normally, in one position in that there's a glutamic acid in the protein coded for by this sequence here. You change that T to an A. One change in 3 billion, it changes the amino acid from a glutamic acid to a valine, and the hemoglobin no longer folds properly, and instead of ordinary red blood cell, you get these sickle red blood cells, and that sickle cell anemia that is particularly prevalent in the African continent. So here there are some examples of, say, point mutations. Other ones are where bits of DNA break off from one chromosome and join onto another one. It rearranges. And a lot of cancers arise from that. The gene is placed in the wrong place within our chromosomes. It's under the wrong control mechanisms. And some bits of DNA occasionally get expanded. During the coding, the replication of DNA, the machinery stutters, and you get repeats. And examples of that are Friedreich's ataxia, Huntington's disease, and some forms of motor neuron disease are genetically inherited and caused by these stutterings. And in the UK, of course, newborns are tested for various inborn errors of metabolism, as they say. Some of the more common ones, phenylketonuria is probably the most common, so that if the child is seen to carry that, then changes can be made, maybe to the diet in many cases, so as the child will not be disabled. The second genome to be sequenced was that of James Watson himself. And it was profound reading some of the literature on that. Michael Egholm was one of those involved in sequencing that and giving advice afterwards as to what that sequence meant. And he said it was so profound how little we were actually able to say to him. To me, it really proved that this is the beginning, not the end. Having that sequence of 3 billion bases doesn't tell us, well, it tells us some things, but there's lots that we just don't know. Move past that. What does DNA do? Let's be clear about this for a moment. It is the repository of our genetic makeup. It codes for proteins via this intermediate molecule called RNA, and we needn't worry about the details of that today. And as I say, different bits of DNA are turned on, expressed in different tissues. And it's responsible, therefore, for our metabolism, our structure, organization, and our development. But yet I ask the question, what does it do? It does everything, but yet it also does nothing. is that I could put a pot of DNA on the bench in front of you here, and it would look like a piece of tissue paper that's gone through the washing machine and the tumble dryer. You know what those things look like when they're all scrunched up. That's just what dried up DNA looks like. It only does something in the context of the cell that it's put in, and the cell actually only does something in the context of the human in which it's expressed in. So by itself, it is just another polymer, but a very important one. You will find frequently the phrase used that DNA is a blueprint, and scientists themselves can casually slip into that sort of language. I want also to encourage you not to use that language, and most scientists, if they think carefully, also won't use it. DNA does contain the information to make proteins and to regulate their production, but it is part of a complex system. As I say, it does nothing by itself. And that the traits emerge from interactions between various genes. And not just the genes themselves, but the genes with their environment. And that environment is something that is different at different times, so that the single fertilized egg is there in the uterus, in the uterine environment. And that then develops in the mother for 9 months. Where it will be subjected to all sorts of different environments, from the things that the mother experiences to the food that she eats. The child is born, and then that DNA is, within the context of the organism, again exposed to different things that maybe modify, add tags to it. It's called epigenetics, where the sequence doesn't change, but tags are added or taken away from the DNA, dependent on the environment in which the person is in. Whether that's the food that they eat, whether it's the stress that they're under, all those things affect that. So that DNA itself is not a blueprint. It's not even really an instruction manual. It contains the information for building a person. But how that is expressed and used varies with time. I mean, an example, maybe a little extreme, is that compare a chimpanzee with a human. You've probably seen the data that says that our genome is 98% similar to theirs. That does not mean that they're 98% made in the image of God. But it's the same genes that often are creating, the chimpanzee is creating the human. And a good example is the shape of the head of the chimpanzee. The genes are switched on for different periods in a human and a chimpanzee. So the jaws of a chimp grow for longer than those of a human at a similar stage in development, and the cranium grows for a shorter period of time. It's the ways in which the genes are expressed, not necessarily the genes themselves. So we can be guilty, if you like, of a kind of genetic reductionism, a kind of genes for us, or genes are us fallacy. We make a God out of DNA as though it's totally in control of everything about us. Clearly, if you have one of those point mutations, one of those genetic diseases, then yes, you can blame your genes. But there are plenty of other ways in which DNA will influence and maybe limit the things that we can do. But it itself is not, if you like, the master controller. We are more than just the sum of our genes, and we should not subscribe to any form of genetic fatalism. Richard Dawkins said, DNA neither cares nor knows, it just is. And I'd agree with that statement itself. It's just another molecule. It has no emotion. It's detached, if you like. But then he goes on to say, we dance to its music. And there I take issue with that. Is that, yes, it controls and influences some of the things that we do. But we still have plenty of control over our emotions, our characteristics, etc. Because, as I've already said, that our DNA is epigenetically modified. It's a subject which is fairly new, and it's something that we're beginning to learn about. Right through from the time that we spend in our mothers, those 9 months, through to the sorts of ways that we develop later on in life, the environment that we're exposed to. Changes in temperature, fluctuating chemical environments, and by that I mean the food that you eat, as well as the air that you breathe. Mistakes in DNA occur, and these produce slightly different outcomes. There's little evidence to support in many things a one-to-one relationship between genes and behavior. There may be for structural things like colour of eye and colour of hair, but for behaviours, very little evidence at all. DNA does influence our physical structures, our brains, our eyes, our mouths, our hands, and so on, but our behaviours are a complex association of lots of those structures. And even the structures themselves are very complicated. There's no gene for hands or gene for eyes. Each one of those is a complex cohort of genes interacting together so as to be able to make us the complex beings that we are. And those interactions continue throughout our development. Our environment and our genes interact at all sorts of levels, in the way that we learn, in the way that we acquire skills, in the way in which we become addicted. They shape our characteristics, they shape even our neural networks. There are billions of neural connections in our brain, each of which are firing at different times. And there are not enough genes by a long, long way to dictate how each one of those are made. They're influenced by the things that we do and that we reinforce. We are creatures of habit. So London taxi drivers have parts of their hippocampus that is expanded beyond ordinary people because they've had to memorize spatial maps of London. And that repeated behavior has caused parts of their brain to change in structure. And similarly, those who play musical instruments, you'll find parts of their brain are changed. So it's not just limited and dictated by the sequence of the DNA. Genes affect our potential, but they alone do not determine or define it. They provide the potential for personhood, but they aren't sufficient to make us human. In fact, the human genome itself supports ongoing learning and interaction. So, to come back to the sort of genes for thing, there are variants in the ways in which different biochemical molecules are metabolized and processed. Dopamine, serotonin, etc. are neurotransmitters that are involved in all sorts of neural processes, and they do affect our behavior. But make it clear, there are no genes for fast sports cars or roller coasters. There may be genes that affect our predisposition to take risks, but there are no genes for liking Volvos, no genes for Buddhism or Hinduism or Christianity or religion as opposed to atheism, and I'll touch on that in a moment as well. We've already said that we're made in the image of God. Christians believe that. We might debate as to exactly what that image means. Created in his image and likeness, as it says in Genesis chapter 1. But clearly our DNA sequence is not dictating that. 98% similar to humans does not make 98% made in the image of God. God, after all, is spirit, not flesh and blood. God is relational, Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, as we, as relational beings, are far more than just our DNA sequence. And God is ruler. The image we are is the image of the King, his representative. All of us made in the image of God, not just the king or the bishop or the priest, but all humanity made in the image of God. So genes, I say again, may limit our abilities, but we're much more than the sum of our genes. A question raised in the prestigious scientific magazine Science: what genetic changes make us uniquely human? And within that it says we're in the age of the genome, but we can still recognize that it takes much more than genes to make a human. We're not just defined by a chemical makeup, but by relationships as well. I think it's an African saying that is, a person becomes a person through persons. It's the cultural environment in which we are, the people that we mix with, that really defines us as our personhood. Just in the same way as DNA does nothing except in the context of the cell, and the cell does nothing except in the context of the organism, so we as humans are especially defined as people as we interact with other people. Genetic information does not dictate everything about us, said Walter Gilbert, who is one of the discoverers of how to sequence DNA. We must see beyond the first reaction that we're the consequence of our genes. We're guilty of a crime because our genes made me do it. I'll look at that in a moment. Or we're noble because our genes made me do it. This is shallow genetic determinism. It's unwise and untrue. There speaks a secular scientist. We learn some things from our DNA, though, that are humbling. The DNA code is the same in all organisms. Whether we're talking about us or a chimpanzee or a fruit fly or a banana or a worm or a bacterium or a virus, the DNA code is exactly the same. Reminds us of our humble origins. From dust we came and to dust we shall return. Our chemical makeup we have, it's in common with the rest of the biological order. Our genomes too are the records of our past. You find bits within our genomes that show things to do with our molecular evolution, particularly viruses that have infected us and inserted within the genomes and places where they're located. And you can see those locations and how they vary and whether they're there or not in chimpanzees, in humans, and then go back through all sorts of other organisms and construct, if you like, evolutionary trees based on our DNA sequence, and they match very closely the sorts of evolutionary trees that have been drawn up by the anatomists and the physiologists for many, many years. And hidden within our genes are some fascinating things about genes that we no longer need or use and have since been corrupted and no longer functional. You know you should take your 5 a day, don't you? Yes? I hope you do. I've no idea what 5 means, whether it's 5 grapes or 5 oranges. It's rather different. And that's because we can't make our own vitamin C. We need to ingest it. If you look carefully within our genomes, you can find the gene for making vitamin C. But over generations, over evolutionary time, it's been corrupted and it's no longer functional because we don't need to make it. We've lived in environments that are very rich in vitamin C. So it's a sign of our evolutionary past. Let me skip past a few of these too. Again, signs of our evolutionary past. We can look in our genomes too and see the ways in which we've been related to other hominids. Neanderthals died out probably 20 to 30,000 years ago. We know very little about them, but their genome has now been sequenced based on DNA extracted from Neanderthal bones. And you can then see how much of Neanderthal DNA might be within ours. And differing according to where in the world you come from, it varies between 1% and 4% of our genetic makeup probably comes from Neanderthals. I don't know if that's a shock to you or you find that offensive. That's the way it is. And in fact, those from Africa have less Neanderthal DNA in them than those who are Europeans. Because if you think of the out of Africa hypothesis for human evolution, those Africans stayed there. Those who went to the rest of the world, of course, migrated out and had greater chance to interbreed, maybe, with Neanderthals. Now, some people say, well, we've got Neanderthal DNA within us. That makes us raw brutes, doesn't it? We're pretty ignorant, and we don't want that. Beware. Some of these social conservatives, and I use that phrase pejoratively, I mean the white supremacists in the US, have taken that the other way round and said, well, actually, Neanderthal DNA makes us strong and butch and intelligent, doesn't it? So we, of course, in the white West, are far more intelligent because we've got Neanderthal DNA in us. Absolute nonsense. There's no grounds for that at all. It's just a function that we have more of that DNA within us. But does DNA really control our destiny? Is biology destiny, says the article? And you might think that's coming from a biological magazine. No, that comes from the International Socialist Review. Genes, politics, discovery, challenges and progress, coming from trends in genetics. Do we have genes for friendship, social interaction, etc.? Do we have genes that dictate our politics? And the answer, of course, is no, we don't. but the variants in our genome can affect the ways in which we take risks, the ways in which we socialize and interact with other people. But it can be taken to extremes. Here is an article from the very well-respected magazine Nature that usually publishes very well-researched articles. An increasing number of studies suggest that biology can exert a significant influence on political beliefs and behaviors. Genes could exert a pull on attitudes concerning topics such as abortion, immigration, the death penalty, pacifism. Really? A significant influence? Maybe a minor component in the way that we think. And it goes on, it's difficult to change someone's mind about political issues because their reactions are rooted deep in their physiology. Think about the implications to that if you really believe that. Now, as those of you who are Christians and church leaders, there's no point in trying to influence people to change their minds over things. No point in trying to persuade them of the truth of the Christian message if their beliefs are rooted in their DNA. Think of the implications of that too for society. If you really believe that people's behavior is influenced predominantly by their DNA, then changing social structures isn't going to affect things at all. You don't want to try and change society. You need to change the individuals in society. And taken to its extreme, that's what Nazism tried to do. Because it's the people themselves, their genetic makeup. And we would find that totally abhorrent. If you really believe that, the solution, therefore, to change or even eliminate the individuals, not to challenge existing social structures. And the gospel compels us to challenge structures and to work for the poor and the weak and the vulnerable in a way in which the survival of the fittest would not do. And that takes us back, if you like, to some of the things that were said in the 19th century and beyond. Characteristics such as pauperism, criminality, feeble-mindedness were biologically inherited. This is from Charles Davenport, writing early in the 20th century. We shouldn't let them loose upon society and permit them to perpetuate their offspring in these animal traits. And those, we may shut our eyes to it, but until I think the mid-1960s, there was in the US still the policy of the sterilization of the feeble-minded. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, says Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, writing in 1927. So the sterilization of those who are seen to be feeble and weak and corrupt and criminal-minded. Is there indeed a gene for criminality? Is our behavior dictated by our genetic makeup? Ladies, can you put your fingers in your ears for a moment? Because there is a correlation between our genes and criminality, and it's called possessing a Y chromosome, which is what makes you a man. It's one of the clearest correlations there is. Over 90% of the inhabitants of jails across the globe are men. And they possess the Y chromosome. But I hope we wouldn't say that all men are criminals. I hope that 99 point whatever percent of us are perfectly law-abiding, ordinary people. It's not dictated by us. It may mean that more men are criminals, but it doesn't make us criminals. Association does not mean causation. In fact, there are some males who possess an extra Y chromosome. They mostly don't know it. They live perfectly normal lives, and they're no more prone to be criminal than the ordinary man with a single Y chromosome. What about genes for aggression? There are some genes that do seem to be linked to, in some ways, more aggressive behavior. You'll be familiar with adrenaline, noradrenaline. I'm sure you've heard of it, the flight or fight response. Now, put in a panic situation, adrenaline is released, and your body gets going. You've got to get rid of that adrenaline somehow, and that's metabolized by an enzyme called monoamine oxidase. Breaks it down. Now, if you have a mutation in that enzyme, the noradrenaline, the adrenaline stays around longer, and therefore that response is exaggerated. And we do know from animal studies that increasing levels of that can lead to some form of aggression. A study was discovered, a family in Holland in the 1990s, which over several generations in males had shown particularly aggressive behavior and showed that they had a complete deficiency of one form of the enzyme that metabolized that noradrenaline. It's a very rare mutation. In fact, as far as I'm aware, that is the only family that has shown that, and they also show a number of other mental conditions as well. It's extremely rare. But what might we do with that information? Let me give you a case example in American law. Stephen Mobley shot the owner of a pizza parlor, killed him in cold blood, and admitted to the crime. There was no question of his guilt at all. When he came to trial, his lawyers asked the judge if he could be tested for that monoamine oxidase gene. Was he culpable or not? Was he to blame, or could he blame his genes? I wonder what you would have done if you were the judge in that situation. Whether you would have allowed him to be tested. The judge in that case said the law was not ready to accept such evidence and so did not allow him to be tested, and ultimately Stephen Mobley went to the electric chair. There is another study done in New Zealand, not on that variant of that, but on other variants where it has weak or strong activity. And for that, comparing children over some years and looking which form of the gene did they have, the active or the less active form, and comparing to what environment they were brought up in, a loving environment or an abusive environment. And the only correlation is if you had that gene and were brought up in an abusive environment, you had a greater chance of becoming aggressive. Genes and environment together, not one or the other, but the two together. Then there are plenty who had that gene, even were brought up in an aggressive environment, who were lived perfectly normal, law-abiding lives as well. So again, it's not determinist. Let me just skip past. There's another case for that. If you were a judge and you knew you had that information, that somebody had a mutation in one of their neurotransmitter genes, what would you do with that information? Would you give a lighter sentence because it wasn't their fault? Or would you give a tougher sentence because actually they were determined to be criminal, and so you should protect the public from them? And you run the risk of a deterministic outcome whereby somebody's guilty even before they've committed a crime. And if you knew your genetic risk and you failed to tell anybody, would you be guilty still? If you didn't tell your children, you didn't tell your GP, your insurance agent, or the rest of them about your genetic makeup, would you be guilty of a crime? I think not. Genes do not turn their owners into killers. There are plenty of people who have that genetic baggage and yet who are not. The vast majority of people with those sorts of genes behave quite normally. Can I blame my genes? Genes may affect our potential, but we're still responsible for our action. We are, after all, even as Richard Dawkins says, we're the only ones who can escape from our genes. We have doctors, social benefits, hospitals. We can tame and overthrow the tyranny of the gene. And for the Christian who is compelled, instructed to take care of the weak and the vulnerable and the poor in society, and to look after those who maybe do come through with some genetic baggage, as we might put that. We have our own responsibility. I rather like this quote from Mark Twain. You'll be aware of the George Washington quotes. Mark Twain said, "I'm different to Washington. I have a higher, grander standard of principle than Washington could not lie," as the quote goes. "I can lie, but I won't. I choose not to, not that I'm determined one way or the other." Just in a few moments, and Ruth is going to jump in a moment and tell me to shut up. Are we genetically disposed to believe in God? Maybe there's a gullibility gene that those of us in this room who are Christian believers have got. There's a rather bad book published in the early 2000s called The God Gene that made quite a bit of a press profile. And he correlated the presence or absence of a particular form of storage vesicle, again for noradrenaline, this VMAT2 gene, as to which version of that you had, as to whether you were spiritual or not. It was done by questionnaires, and it was something called transcendence that seemed to vary. It has never been published in the peer-reviewed scientific literature, and as Carl Zimmer, writing in Scientific American, rather pours scorn on it, this is a gene that accounts for less than 1% the variance found in scores of so on and so forth, things that can signify everything to belonging to the Green Party to believing in extrasensory perception, according to one unpublished, unreplicated study. There is no such evidence as something for the God gene. If there was, then of course you could, in theory, vaccinate people against it. And you might want to do a Google search for something called FunVax. It's a spoof CIA report that says that we could calm the Middle East down, couldn't we, by vaccinating everybody against belief in God, and then all the extremism would go away. It is, of course, a complete hoax. John Polkinghorne wisely said, "The idea of a God gene goes against all my personal theological convictions. You cannot cut faith down to the lowest common denominator of genetic survival. It shows the poverty of such a reductionist thinking." And Francis Collins again puts it quite succinctly, "I have evolved from being a committed atheist in my 20s to being a firm believer in my 50s. During my conversion, there is no evidence that my DNA changed. The notion that spirituality is hardwired cannot be entirely correct." Just as an aside, as we finish, we now have the ability, though, to edit genomes, to actually go in with molecular, very precise, fancy tools to change genomes. There are plenty of laws that say we shouldn't do it. Could we, in the long run, do that? And here are some names of the technologies. CRISPR-Cas9, it sounds like a cooking oil. It's not. It's a very clever molecular technique for going in and modifying genomes to be able to correct things. Should we do that? It's revolutionary. It's a breakthrough. It will make great changes, and we need to be prepared for it and see what our response to it. Is it tinkering? Is it going where only God should go? Or is it another form of healing and therapy? And we need to decide on that. And there have been some remarkable instances, not of germline therapy, but of modifying cells, particularly in this case here, Lila Richards, who was in a terminal form of leukemia, treated with modified cells that and subsequently recovered from the leukemia. So we have these great advances in technology. Should we use them? In most cases now, we're in that actually there's little that can be achieved by that can't be achieved by other in vitro techniques of screening of embryos. So I don't think there's any compelling reason for doing it, but what we could end up with a form of genetic enhancement by being able to modify genomes, changes in IQ or physique or sporting ability. One thing I want to close on, though, is what does that say about us as humans and how we respect other people. Here is Tom Shakespeare writing. He suffers from something that is, well, in simple terms called dwarfism. It's achondroplasia. I can't even say the word. It's a long genetic predisposition. And he rightly says that people with disabilities are not queuing up for genetic modification. Their priority is to combat discrimination and prejudice. The voices of people living with illness and impairment need to be heard. And nothing about us without us is their slogan, if you like. I have achieved everything, he says, I hope for in life despite having restricted growth, career, children, friendship and love. He wouldn't want to have his own genes altered in any way to change that. And I've got some examples that I won't show you of instances where people have said, I really don't want my genome changed. I live a perfectly fulfilled life as even though I have odd genes. You might like to read this book by Perfect People by Peter James. It's a lovely fiction book. It's a kind of science fiction thriller. It, in a slightly exaggerated way, takes you through some of the consequences of if you modify genomes. the subtext is, be careful what you wish for. I read it over Christmas, and it was one of those that I couldn't put down, and I'm not a great fiction reader. The Christian conviction is that free will is real, and it's critical in ensuring our moral responsibility in ways that are entirely compatible still with God being sovereign and in control. In the same ways our DNA affects us, it influences us, but yet we are still held responsible. You can search the scriptures, it's there in many places. I tell you, men will have to give account on the day of judgment for every careless word they have spoken. And the assumption of human responsibility is central to the Christian faith. Free will is, after all, a precious gift bestowed on us by God. And there's just a few passages I close with that show that our characters can change irrespective of our DNA. Our genetics is not in control of who we are. To all who received him, says John, writing of Jesus, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, children born not of natural descent, not your genetic inheritance, not of human decision or a husband's will, and I think now they'd add another phrase on top of that, not dictated by your genome, but born of God. Paul, writing in Philippians, talks about, if you like, his genetic cultural background, circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, the tribe of Benjamin, Hebrew of Hebrews. All the genetic characteristics that you could hope for in Paul, says, I now consider that loss for the sake of Christ. Paul, writing in Corinthians, we are being transformed into his likeness. No transformation in genomes, but transformation in characters. And if anyone is in Christ, they're a new creation. The new creation has come, the old has gone, the new is here. Changes in our behavior, our characteristics, our spirituality, irrespective of our genomes. So I want to look at that DNA molecule and say it's fascinating, it's wondrous, it fills me with awe as I look at it. I can look at the genome and say, great are the works of the Lord, or in the way the Message describes that, puts that, Psalm 111 verse, God's works are so great, worth a lifetime of study, endless enjoyment. It's a fascinating molecule. It tells us plenty of things about our makeup, but yet it also points to how wonderful God is himself. And one of my students, as a thank you when she graduated, drew this little picture and gave me this quote from Isaiah 65. The Lord says, be glad and rejoice forever in what I create. And just to show it's a student do it, unfortunately she drew the helix left-handed instead of right-handed. Thank you.
I'm forever in terror of putting a left-handed helix on something I do for fear Keith will point it out. Thank you, Keith, for that. And are there any questions now for him based on that?
My question is, with this non-reductionist view of our genes, give to Christian bioethics a better view for the researches in human cloning, for example?
Yes, it does. How we as Christians respond to what we should do, it does affect a lot. I personally believe that human cloning would be wrong. We should not do that. It's us dictating what we want. But on the other hand, it would be flawed, because two identical people brought up in different environments will be different, as we know from identical twins. No, they are effectively clones. Identical twins are, and yet they're totally different people. They're each one made in the image of God as individuals with their own responsibility and their own characteristics as they do change over time, both physically and the ways in which their genomes will be modified epigenetically. Cloning is something we should not do, because I think it says something about our hubris as human beings and trying to make things in our image as we want them. But should it happen, and I'm fatalistic, I think it probably will happen, that those clones are still human, and we treat them as human and we respect them as humans, made in the image of God, with all the responsibilities and the characteristics that any human does. There is that other side to it, is how are we going to respond to the clone, to the modified human when they're there? And I think we simply say they are human in the same way as we are, and we treat them with the same respect and dignity. I hope we don't go there, but I suspect we will.
Yes, just here.
I just wanted to ask, does any of the science in this area challenge or cause you any theological difficulties or challenge any theological standpoints you have?
No, I don't think it does. Because I say that the DNA is not saying that it's dictating us. If it was, we were slaves of our DNA, and everything about our character was, and that effectively our destiny was determined right from the day we were born by our DNA, then yes, that would challenge me. But everything about the science says it's not that way. That we are responsible for our actions. That our DNA does not dictate everything about us. It may limit in some way our ability to do things. At a very simple level, it's no good me thinking that I'm going to be a rugby player, because I just don't have the genes for playing rugby, I'm afraid. The physique is all wrong, the muscle makeup. So it limits what we do. But it doesn't control us. If it was that it controlled everything we do, then I think that would raise serious theological and ethical, moral issues. But it doesn't. We're still responsible for what we are. It does raise other questions which are maybe related to what happens when DNA goes wrong. Right? So if you like, it brings back the whole area of suffering and a God of love, of the mutations that can happen in DNA that give rise to genetic diseases or to give rise to cancers. And that sounds trite, but to say, well, that's the way that life works. And for so many things in the physical world, it has a positive side as much as a negative side. So water refreshes and we need it, but it drowns. Fire warms, but it burns. Genetic variation is essential for the evolutionary process that's brought us here. And yet DNA mutations, as well as being the driver of mutation, of evolution, also give rise to unpleasant diseases. And that brings us back to the whole question of suffering, a God of love, which philosophers and theologians have debated for centuries. And this adds, if you like, another dimension to it, but I don't think it challenges it anymore.
Thank you. Yes, in your view, at what point in evolution did we become fully human, and what was the critical last change to the DNA?
The answer is I don't know. So let me make that clear. Whatever I say now, the take-home message is I don't know. We don't even know what the spiritual state of Neanderthals is. The anthropologist, and I hasten to add, I'm not an anthropologist, will say over other hominids as to did they show any signs of spirituality in the way they respected their dead? Did they have burial rites? Was there any sign that maybe they believed in an afterlife? And there is some evidence that Neanderthals may have done that in the way that they treated their dead. I don't necessarily think that proves anything about spirituality. I think it is not for us to know that. Our responsibility is to us now, is we know our spiritual makeup. We know that we're made in the image of God. We know we have moral and ethical demands that are made upon us. Whether that was true for other ancient hominids, I don't know. The Genesis account of Adam and Eve, that is, in my view, a picture of the way in which God made the world, not to be taken literally. It's not a science textbook, but plants Adam and Eve in a Neolithic age of about, they were primitive farmers 10,000 years ago, is when the Neolithic age would have been. Whether that still is a picture, whether there was an Adam and Eve, whether that's when we became made in the image of God with special characteristics, to be honest, I don't know, and the science is quiet about that. There are very few genes that are specifically human. I think I tried to emphasize that with the chimpanzee thing. It isn't necessarily say this is the gene that makes us distinct. There are genes that help towards some of our physiology, the way in which our structures enable us to speak. You could never train a chimpanzee to speak. They don't have the right anatomical makeup. And those things may have helped towards our becoming of human as we communicate with each other. The genes and the ways in which they're switched on that lead to brain development will have led to our increase in consciousness, our ability to think, and etc. But I don't think you can pinpoint that to one particular gene or any particular time in the evolutionary history. So that's a long and rambling answer that says we don't know.
Thank you, Keith. Now we'll go to the back here and then we'll come to the front.
Hello. This may be a slightly controversial question, but there's one or two people in my congregation who feel that I can't preside because I have two X chromosomes as opposed to an X and a Y chromosome. Could you comment on that, please? I just say I have rather more genes to take care of. Thank you very much.
I don't think that science has anything to say on that. There are clearly differences between men and women. Men have that rather feeble Y chromosome that some say actually it is so degenerate and so small that ultimately it might cease to be and you can do without Y chromosome.
Change the gene for pattern baldness.
Yes. And clearly there are physiological differences between men and women, sometimes in the way in which we think and the way in which we behave, and we can stereotype what a man and a woman might be. My wife talks about old women of both sexes. Right? But no, I don't think the science does say that at all. Those taking that view that says a woman shouldn't preside are simply taking a few verses, particularly from Paul, which I think were written in a particular cultural context, that there's nothing in the genome that says a woman cannot preside. That would be my view anyway.
Okay, let's come to the front with the person with the grey jersey.
What do you think of homosexuality, Doctor? Like, no, I've got people who tell me like I've tried, but like I just can't love a woman, right?
Right. The homosexuality thing is convoluted and complex. There is no gene for homosexuality. You might occasionally see things in the media that suggest there might be. There is nothing. There's a very good article written by Dennis Alexander, published in Science and Christian Belief, I think about a couple of years ago, which gives the scientific evidence one way or other and compiles all the data for homosexuality. It's in Science and Christian Belief, for which I have the privilege of being editor. Normally it's a subscription-only journal. For that particular article, it's free access. So you can download that. If you see me afterwards, I'll show you how you can do that. And that brings together all the various bits of evidence. It is long and complicated. Clearly, you're quite right. There are people who say, it's just the way I am. I have tried one way or the other. I really wish I wasn't, but it's just in my makeup. And that clearly is the case. Whether that is they've come to that position as a result of a complex interaction between a number of different genes, with the environment that they were in utero, with the way in which they were brought up, with all sorts of things. It is very complicated. It comes back, I think, again, whatever position one takes on the same sex, we treat people as individuals and we respect them as people. Whether or not we agree with their lifestyle is my view that as Christians we're responsible for treating them with respect and honour as fellow human beings made in the image of God.
Now, any more questions? I've got one here and then we'll go further back.
Thanks, Keith. Riding on the back of that, can we explore the issue of transgender, which is becoming for many of us a very complex issue? separate from the issue of sexual homosexuality,
Yes.
but certainly is a big elephant in the room.
And again, I think again, I wouldn't. There is no such thing as a gene for, and it's not my speciality, so I hesitate to go there. But I think again, it's a very, very complex issue. That whether there's a genetic component, I hesitate over. What's causing that psychology that says somebody feels they're, if you like, in the wrong body? I don't feel qualified in order to comment on that. But you're right. Why should it be an issue that is more prevalent now than it has been? Our genetic makeup as human beings has not changed. The culture, the society that we live in has changed, and people's perception. And it may well be that people are more open to talk about those things, whereas in previous generations they wouldn't do, and actually the feelings were still exactly the same, but if you like, suppressed. I'm not sure I quite subscribe to that view. The genetic pool has not changed. Culture and society has, which I think says more about the if you like, the social drive that's causing this, rather than the genetic influences.
Thank you. And the gentleman with the black jersey.
A bit of an aside question, possibly, Keith, on mitochondrial DNA donation, donor for couples with mitochondrial deficiency in one of the partners. I just wonder what you thought about that.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with that. The media do not use helpful phrases, and they often do many things within DNA research. So they will talk about three-parent babies. It's actually 99.999% come from just two parents. For those who are not familiar with it, your mitochondria, which are the organelles within your cells responsible for making your energy, the ATP, are inherited entirely from your mother. So that you can trace back your mitochondrial inheritance from mother to mother to mother to mother. So if you have a mitochondrial mutation, it can cause some fairly debilitating conditions. And we have the technology, in fact the license has been given to be able to, by manipulations, to take effectively the nucleus out of a cell that has that mitochondria that are deformed, and to put that nucleus into another cell from which the nucleus has been removed and for which has healthy mitochondria. We might call it mitochondrial transplants, whereas the media call it three-parent babies. I personally view that as a form of healing and therapy. That's a very, very long way from genetic enhancements and genetic manipulation and any form of eugenics. It's a long, long way from that. Now, some will argue it's the beginning of the slippery slope. I don't like the slippery slope argument particularly. There are places we shouldn't go, but I personally don't have a problem with mitochondrial transplant.
Yes, no one right at the back.
Linking back to what we were talking about yesterday with the design, would you say that DNA comes under the same category as forming parameters within which life runs and therefore becomes part of the design sort of modem of we must be designed because of the existence of something like DNA?
I wasn't here yesterday. Unfortunately, I had to be in Southampton for a research day, so I missed those discussions you had yesterday. DNA, various people have made different things about the complexity of the DNA molecule. Often, computer scientists and engineers look at DNA, if you like, as being a code. And a code, of course, has to have somebody who is a codifier and look upon that where there's evidence of design. The biochemist looks at that and says, well, it's something that has changed over time. It's been a process of selecting what works and what doesn't work, and it's just through that evolutionary process. A number of people who are sort of DNA chemists, though, have looked at the DNA molecule itself and said, is it special? Stephen Benner, who as far as I know has no faith at all, he calls himself an astrobiologist. He works in, I forget which lab in the USA. He's a DNA chemist, makes DNA. originally said, looking at the molecule, if you were starting from scratch, you would never design DNA like that. It's a stupid molecule. It's held together by hydrogen bonds, for those who know a bit of the chemistry, and hydrogen bonds are weak, and especially weak in water. Would you trust your genetic inheritance to hydrogen bonds in water? And the answer is no, you wouldn't. But then he then looks at the properties of that molecule, in the ways in which it's got to be stable and yet be able to separate that, from which mutations can happen within that, and yet that one mutation doesn't make the whole cell unviable, that mutations can happen and it's still viable. And actually there's something very special about the DNA molecule. And he suggested that if we find life on other planets, that the kind of molecule that will encode the genetic information is likely to be very similar to the DNA molecule that we're familiar with. Well, may not be identical. So in terms of the, if you like, the inevitability of the evolutionary process, there is something about that DNA molecule that says there's not much else that we can think of, and there's a bit of hubris for you, that could possibly have replaced that. So design, inevitability, you pays your money, you takes your choice with that. But for the Christian, of course, that God is upholding that whole process. It is his molecule. Now, whether he actually stepped in to say, actually, I think we need an extra carbon there and an extra nitrogen there, and that base pair's wrong and we need this one, that's a different question. But he is upholding the universe, and it is his molecule.
So rather than using the language of design, are you saying the special universe produced a special molecule?
I think that's much closer to it. Thank you, Ruth. I'm quite happy with that.
Okay, now, one last question, and we'll come to the front, please.
No, we didn't.
Sorry. Sorry, just...
I would like to know your opinion on germline modification, maybe soon possible by CRISPR-Cas.
Yes, and we could spend a lot of time talking about that. It depends why you're modifying the germline. There are a number of risk factors in modifying the germline that says we've got to be very careful what you do, because you might end up modifying something that you don't intend to as well as what you do. So risk is a big factor, but even if we could get the risk factors out, should we or should we not? For some diseases, I think I would say could be a form of healing, in the same way as we have Christian doctors and medics who are doing all sorts of wonders of healing that enable people to live in ways that generations past they could not have done. This is another form of healing. However, and it's what I hinted there, there's very, very few diseases that we could genetically modify to prevent the disease that we could not also deal with by other means. So genetic modification will be an in vitro one where you'll have to screen the embryos you've modified anyway. We have plenty of in vitro technologies for screening embryos anyway, so it'll just be an embryo selection instead of an embryo modification. So there's little that says we have to do that. When it comes to modifying embryos for, if you like, cosmetic or enhancement reasons, I don't think we should go there at all. Whether it's changing, if you like, muscle structure so as to make somebody more athletic, or if we could change IQ, and IQ is probably influenced by as many as 200 genes, or maybe more. So it's unlikely we could ever do that. But even if we could, I don't think we should do that. But as a medical healing tool, if we got rid of any questions of risk, I think it's just another form of medical technology, and we have plenty of them. But do read some of the fiction, because it's scary.
Great, thank you very much, Keith. We've worked you very hard. So.